Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I was on hour 9 of an overnight maintenance shift when the storm finally rolled over the hills and settled on Millstone. The substation sits at the edge of town, where the valley opens toward the river, a fenced rectangle of steel frames, ceramic insulators, and transformers the size of delivery vans. Rain hammered the gravel and pinged on the sheet metal cabinet doors. Each gust banged the chain link a little and drummed through the lighting masts, and the structure answered with a low metallic hum that I'd always found comforting. I'm an electrician by trade and a substation technician by practice. I know the rhythm of our grid, the way a mechanic knows the sound of a healthy engine. At 2:30 a.m, the meters were steady, even if the sky was not. I took another sip of coffee that had turned bitter and cold and logged the time. My name is Evan Hartley. I'm 34 years old, married, and I have lived in Millstone most of my life. We have one police station, one diner open late on weekends, and a main street that holds a hardware store, a pharmacy, and a brick library with a mural faded by years of Pennsylvania winters. Our substation takes power from 2 transmission lines and steps it down for the town and the farms to the south. On paper, it is simple: transformers, circuit breakers, and reclosers that can open and close automatically to clear a fault and try again. In practice, it is an instrument you learn to read by ear and by feel. A storm like this tests every connection and every tree limb that hangs too close to a line. I had the radio tuned between weather and the county emergency channel, volume low, the words buried under static. The National Weather Service weather receiver was on its alert standby mode, the kind that shrieks when a tornado warning hits the county. Tonight it had been chiming with short tests and a severe thunderstorm warning, the usual, and then a longer bulletin around 2:05 a.m. that was not weather. It said public health situation. It recommended staying indoors. It did not elaborate, which used to bother me, but no longer did. Messages are written in templates so dispatchers can fill them fast, and sometimes details come later. I marked the bulletin number on my log and went back outside to watch the breakers through the fence. The maintenance radio on my belt is a rugged handheld that can talk to our crew channel and scan the county. The audio began to change around 2:20 a.m. A dispatcher tried to hold a calm tone while her words tripped over the storm. She said the hospital had activated its lockdown. She repeated a request for all available officers. What bled through the static was single words and fragments: unresponsive, aggressive, don't let them. And then a call sign from a patrolman I recognized, voice tight, asking for additional units on Ridgeview Avenue. I made a note. Sometimes people get desperate during disasters, but the hospital going into lockdown at 2 in the morning was new. I walked the perimeter with my flashlight beam slashing rain into bright threads. I checked the padlocks on the transformer yard gates and the grounding straps that prevent the cabinets from building a static charge. A substation is like a ship at anchor. Every part is tied down, or it does not belong. The downstream loads were normal. You could tell where the overnight bakery ovens pulled and where the water plant cycled its motors. Our supervisory control and data acquisition system, spelled out because I hate how people hide behind the abbreviation, showed that the automatic reclosers were on their 2-try setting for the storm. If a tree branch touched a line, the system would open the circuit and try again twice before locking out so we could inspect the fault. I sent a text to my shift partner, a reminder we use every storm. Leave it at 2 tries or we'll be babysitting blown fuses all morning. The message sent, but took longer than normal to show delivered. The rain eased for a moment as the weather front passed overhead, leaving low mist in the valley and a smell like wet iron. I stood under the control house roof to smoke and decided not to. Instead, I turned the radio back up. The dispatcher's voice had moved from steady to clipped. She cut across units talking over each other and asked them to repeat traffic one at a time. Someone yelled about the high school parking lot. Another unit asked if the hospital had room. The answer was no. A nurse came on the line frantic and was told to clear the channel. In the gaps, the weather radio chimed again, but the words were dull and slow, as if read from a script. Do not go outside. Lock all doors. Stay in your homes. It repeated, then repeated again, as if the machine had lost its place and was set to loop. At 2:38 a.m., one of the breakers on the south feeder opened and reclosed. A blue flash reflected off the fog from somewhere down the line. A transient fault, a branch brushing the conductor and then falling. The breaker stayed in. I logged it. The grid felt fine. The town did not. By 2:45 a.m., the county channel had become useless noise. Several people talking at once. The dispatcher asking them to stop transmitting unless it was life and death, which it all sounded like it was. I recognized the voice of Officer Dwyer. He coached Little League and always bought donuts at the station on Saturdays. He said something about biting, then started to say something else, and then the radio carried only a feed of wind noise and a clatter that sounded like a microphone hitting a floor. I closed the breaker's mimic panel door slowly and felt the nearness of home in my chest like a tug. Our place is barely a 5-minute drive from the substation if the roads are clear. A ranch house with a deep porch and a yard that slopes toward a drainage ditch full of cattails. My wife, Lena, is a second-grade teacher. She keeps a drawer of paper cutouts shaped like stars and a file of past lesson plans on a flash drive she updates every Sunday. She goes to bed early. The alarm on my phone told me my shift ended at 6. I decided I would not wait. I shut down the substation control house to night mode and set the automated alarms to push through if the system saw anything outside the normal range. The backup generator under the eave cranked to life automatically because of a momentary drop in feed. It smelled like warm diesel and clean exhaust, a smell I used to associate with winter storms and neighborhood block parties where the borrowed light towers ran through the night. My maintenance radio cracked again. Someone shouted, "They're running!" and then the line swallowed him. I locked the door, slid under the steering wheel of my old Ford Ranger, and let the heater blow on the windshield until it cleared a hole in the fog, big enough to see the gravel track. The truck's tires crunched wet stones as I turned out onto County Line Road. The wet reflected red and blue where the highway bent beyond the mill. 2 cruisers shot past, lights on, sirens blaring, heading toward town. Sirens at this hour in Millstone are rare enough that you get up and look out the window. Tonight, you would have seen them a dozen times. Half a mile along, I saw a man walking barefoot down the shoulder, soaked to the skin and bare from the waist up, head cocked to one side as if listening to something across the field. I slowed to keep distance without stopping. His eyes slid across the truck and did not land on anything. His mouth worked as if he were trying to remember a word. He moved wrong in a way I struggled to describe. It was not just a limp or drunken stagger. It was like his body had been given a task with missing steps, and he kept repeating the wrong part. I pulled around him slowly, put the window up, and took the next right. As the truck climbed the low hill toward our street, lights flickered across town. You could see the grid pulse in a pattern I had only seen during big outages, when circuits try to hold and then fall. The hospital's orange emergency lights burned steady on the ridgeline, where it overlooks the river. The houses below rolled through warm bedroom lamplight to black and back as people found flashlights and then found out batteries were not where they remembered them being. At 3:06 a.m., I turned into our driveway and nearly sighed when I saw our porch lights still burning. It shut off and on again as if waving at me, then held steady. Lena met me at the door with our dog, Nala, pressed up against her shin. Nala is a mutt with a herding dog's alertness, and a lab's need to rest her cheek on your knee. Tonight she was all bristle and low growl. Lena's eyes were wide, and her hair was thrown into a bun that never lasted a full day in her classroom, but could last a week when she was anxious. "Did you hear the radio?" she asked. "I heard something," I said. "Are you okay?" She stepped back so I could come in. The emergency alert was on our living room television, all local programming overridden by a blue screen with white block text. It said, "Emergency message, Civil authorities, do not go outside, lock all doors, stay hidden. The audio in a flat voice repeated the same 3 sentences every 30 seconds. A line at the bottom scrolled with county names, and, after each, a time until a review. As if the message would expire and be replaced by a clearer one. I knew that time was probably arbitrary. Once the system grabs all channels, it does not easily let go. I tried to call you, she said, and then I tried to call my mum, and then the call showed connected, but no one was there. The screen is stuck like this. The weather radio is saying the same thing. There were sirens all over town. I saw 2 cruisers heading to Maine, I said. Hospital lights are on. I think the cell towers are getting overloaded or the switching center's failing. The dispatch channel was a mess. It sounded like they said people were attacking. She looked at me for a second. Attacking? I do not know any better word. I'm not saying words I cannot take back, I said, which is what we said in our house when we did not want to feed a fear without facts. She nodded. We had always tried to make fear earn its place. We checked the windows and doors. Null followed me and pressed her nose to each seam, where the weather stripping did not quite meet the jam. I slid the deadbolts, turned the privacy pins in the back doors, lowered the blinds. The rain had slowed to a mist so fine you could only see it in the angle of the streetlight's halo. Somewhere to the north, 2 streets over near the park, a long scream started and cut out in the middle, like someone had pulled the plug on a microphone. Null stopped at the front window, set her paws on the sill, and rumbled deep in her chest. We keep long emergencies in mind in our house. We have a basement shelf with bottled water, a tub with a camp stove and fuel canisters, and a plastic tote with batteries, candles, and a crank radio. I brought up the tub and the tote, while Lena filled the tub in the hall bathroom. The old houses in our neighborhood all have storm cellars, half buried, that you enter through double doors that open like a mouth off the backyard. They were for tornadoes and for carrots stored in sand and for movie props in black and white films. I checked ours twice a year and kept a pair of heavy work gloves and a crowbar inside. It felt like something someone's grandfather would insist on and that someone's children would forget about until the day they did not. At 3:17 a.m., the power went out in our neighborhood. I felt it more than saw it, because of how still a house becomes when the refrigerator stops and the air handler stops and even the small hum of the porch light transformer on the front doorbell stops. The emergency broadcast continued from the radio because it had batteries. The television died. The town outside our window became a black shape with a few points of orange where the hospital and the water plant kept their generators running. The repeating voice said, "Do not go outside. Lock all doors. Stay hidden." The words, which had been abstract just minutes before, landed in our living room like a person. I checked my phone for more messages. The grid monitor app showed my substation with most feeders still closed. That made no sense if my lights were out. It meant the outage was probably closer in among the neighborhood lines, and likely a lot of tripping protective devices at once. The app stalled and then froze with a last update time that did not change. The cell signal indicator went from 2 bars to none, even though my phone still displayed LTE as if it were a label no one had removed. There was a knock at the back door. Not a polite set of taps you could ignore, but a heavy, hurried sequence that said the person on the other side was running on adrenaline and had found us by luck. Null lunged and barked 3 times, then fell silent as if she had remembered the broadcast instructions herself. "It's me," a voice called. I knew it. "It's Caleb, please." Caleb is 17 and lives 2 doors down with his parents. He mows our yard for extra money in the summer, even after I told him he charged too little and should ask for more. He plays guitar in the school auditorium in winter concerts, where the parents stand at the back, trying to keep the aisles clear for the exit signs. He is lanky and still growing into his height. His voice accelerated words when he was scared. I peered through the narrow window beside the back door. He stood under the eave, soaked despite the overhang, his hood plastered to his forehead, eyes too wide. He kept looking over his shoulder toward the alley that runs behind our row of ranch houses, the one with trash bins and a low wire fence. and the brown dog that barks whenever anyone so much as thinks about opening a bin lid. "Are you alone?" I asked through the wood. He nodded. "I cannot find my parents," he said. "They went to find my aunt on park. They said they would be back in a minute, and that was an hour ago. I heard something outside and..." He looked back again and swallowed. His hands trembled. "Please." We let him in. We had that argument with our eyes that all couples have. What if? Yes. But. And what are the choices here? He stepped inside and stood dripping water onto the mat. Nal sniffed his shoes and circled, and then backed away with her ears up. I locked the door behind him and slid a heavy chair under the knob, more for my feeling than for actual strength. We led him to the kitchen, and he tried to sit and missed the chair, and then sat again, as if the act of being inside allowed him to crash all at once. "What did you see?" Lena asked, her voice soft so he would not feel that he had to perform his fear for us. "I do not know," he said. "There were people in the street, walking like they were sleepwalking. One of them was my bus driver. He walked right past me and did not look at me, and he was making a sound like he was trying to say his own name. And then two people were running, and one fell, and the other did not help, and just kept running. There were sirens, and then none. The emergency voice kept saying to stay inside. I thought maybe you're good at, plans." "We have a plan," I said, which was true, but felt like a small word against a big night. It is mostly the same for snowstorms, summer outages, and those rare days when the river gets high. We keep quiet, we keep lights low, we wait until we know more. We have a safe place to move to if we cannot stay here. He nodded too fast. He wanted steps he could do one by one until he felt his hands stop shaking. I knew that feeling well. I made a list on a notepad because a list makes you believe there is order. Step 1, water. Step 2, silent checks of the house. Step 3, gather what we would need if we had to move to the cellar. I opened the basement door while Lena and Caleb brought blankets and the medical kit to the top of the stairs. The basement smelled of dryer lint and concrete. I retrieved the hand-crank radio and checked that it's still connected to the county channel, then set it to our local weather station frequency because that was where the emergency broadcast was being repeated from. The voice stepped through the same phrases. No more, no less. Do not go outside. Lock all doors. Stay hidden. It sounded like a teacher reading a spelling list and waiting for students to fill in the words. It worked on me. I wanted to obey because structure is something your body seeks in chaos. I also wanted to gather information because part of me cannot sit still when I know there is a circuit I could close to see where the fault lies. The hours that followed stretched. Without power, the house held cold in a way I had forgotten. A winter draft slipping under doors that I had sworn were sealed. Rain tapped on the vents and on the aluminum ladder that leaned against the back fence from when I'd cleaned the gutters and never put it away. Sound outside became easier to map. Sirens had been a steady wave and then were gone. Now you could pick out the difference between tires hissing on wet pavement and shoes slapping on the same. Between a trash can knocked over by wind and one moved by a person trying not to make noise. Twice we heard a distant gunshot. Once we heard a police siren start and then stop as if someone had turned off a toy. At 4:12 a.m, a voice on the radio cut through the emergency loop. It was a dispatcher I did not recognize and an officer whose call sign I did. They talked over each other. The dispatcher said units were to maintain distance and avoid hand-to-hand contact. The officer said they had barricaded the hospital's main corridor with beds and would hold until more units arrived. The dispatcher said all available units were already engaged. The officer said he had 3 patients restrained and one had stopped breathing and then started moving again. The dispatcher asked him to repeat that, and the hand-crank radio squealed and rolled back into the emergency loop, as if the interruption had been an error the system corrected. Around 4:30 a.m, the rain lightened to a mist that smelled like wet leaves and creosote from the telephone poles. I asked Lena to take a break from listening and from worrying. She made tea with water from the kettle on the camp stove that we set in the sink under the range hood in case it needed to vent heat. Caleb asked if he should go back to his house to get his parents' emergency bag, and then put the question away before we had to answer it. He wrapped his hands around a mug without drinking and stared at the geometry of the countertop as if the square corners would give him steadiness. I walked room to room with Null shadowing me. She listened at each window with her head tilted and her ears in different positions, the way she does when she tries to triangulate a sound. Twice she pressed the cold leather of her nose to the bottom of the front door and then stepped back with her head down and a low growl under her breath. I could feel the sound through the floor. I crouched beside her and listened. The street was quiet except for something like a shoe sliding on wet concrete, then stopping, then sliding again. The motion did not match a normal gait. I looked through the peephole toward the front steps. The porch light was off, and even if it had been on, the mist made it more a suggestion than a light. The shape at the end of the walk might have been a person standing with one shoulder leaning into nothing. I could not tell. "Do not open it," Lena whispered from the hall, not because she thought I would, but because sometimes naming a rule helps everyone keep it. "I will not," I said. And another sound came from the side of the house, where the living room windows faced the short hedges I have always neglected to trim as often as I should. It was the sound of a hand on glass, then another, and then a faint tap like someone trying to find the shape of the window in the dark. When the tapping stopped, another set of taps began a foot to the left, as if the person had shifted carefully without turning a light on. I told myself there could be many reasons for that movement, and that most did not involve a person who needed help. I hated that assessment. I also believed it. Caleb stood in the doorway with the fire axe we keep in the garage for splitting kindling. It is a real axe, not a decorative one. Heavy and dull red with scuffs along the blade from the years I used it to open stubborn paint cans and pry up floorboards when I should have used the right tool. He held it with his hands too close together. I put my hands on the handle and moved his grip apart, and then told him to lean it against the wall where he could reach it. I did not want him to feel like he needed to carry it. The emergency voice repeated, "Stay hidden, do not respond to outside voices." I decided to listen, even though the habit in me that fixes things wanted to move, to open a panel, to trace the fault. At about 4:55 a.m., the neighbor's motion sensor floodlight flicked on across the fenced yard. You could see the shape of someone in the beam, then two more, walking in the slow stop-start way Caleb had described, feet slapping wet concrete softly. Their clothes were soaked and clung to them, so you could see the outlines of elbows and shoulders. One of them stopped and turned his head toward the motion light, as if the light itself had spoken. He made a sound like a word he could not complete. He moved his lips around the shape of it, and then repeated it. They moved toward our fence, but did not climb. They leaned against the boards and slid fingers into the gaps where knotholes had always let wind through. I realized they were not looking for us, because they were not looking for anything, in the sense that looking means noticing and making decisions. They were following sound and light and the way a knight pulls at any motion. "Turn everything off," I whispered, even though I thought we had done that. Lena clicked the camp stove off and turned the knob, as if double-checking could offer more offness. I turned the radio volume down to where it was just enough for me to keep track of the message. The floodlight next door clicked off after its timer ran, and the backyard turned to a faint grey suggestion of fence and hedges and the shape of the shed I keep promising to paint. The three silhouettes stood for another 10 seconds, as if they had to run through an internal checklist that did not contain anything for darkness. Then they began to drift, two toward the alley, one toward the side yard. We held our breaths and did not release them together because there is no choreography for this. Another sound came from the front of the house, a heavier weight landing on wood. Someone or something had stepped onto our porch, hesitating and then stepping again. The boards creaked near the door. Then the sound of a hand on glass began, the same slow, exploratory tapping I had heard on the living room windows. The knock that followed was quiet and wrong. It did not match any knock I knew. A delivery driver's triple rap, a neighbour's pattern, a salesperson's cheerful tapping. It was uneven, 3 taps, and then 2, and then a pause while the person, if it was a person, moved their head slowly, as if listening inside the wood itself. A calm part of my mind tried to catalogue all this as if data would make us safer. I pushed that part away and motioned for us to move from the living room toward the back of the house without crossing any window directly. Null trotted at my heel and then moved ahead of me as if she had decided she was now standard bearer. We gathered the blankets and the kit and the tote with batteries. Lena slung the hand-crank radio strap across her shoulder. Caleb carried the axe and a backpack he had filled with water and a loaf of bread, and I noticed he had added dog treats for Null because he is the kind of kid who can be scared and still think of a dog. We unlatched the basement door and descended each step slowly, careful not to set off the stair that squeaks if you step on the left edge. In the basement, the world above us became a damp murmur. You could hear the house shift and the wind comb the trees. On nights like this before, we would turn on a lamp and set Nala's bed by the washer and watch the news until the storm passed. Tonight there was no lamp and no news, only the radio's steady voice and the warmth of bodies within reach. I set the radio on a shelf and angled the antenna toward the small glass block window where a sidewalk runs above. The voice played its loop. Then, midway through repetition, it skipped and started over, and then the speaker hissed with a high tone like feedback, and then the voice returned, but more metallic, more distorted, as if delivered through a long tunnel lined with tin. At 5:20 a.m., time moves weird when you're counting by breaths instead of clocks, but the wind-up watch on my wrist keeps good time. The house above us creaked with a heavier sound. The front door rattled, not how it does when wind pushes and releases, but in a staccato way that made Nala's lip curl. The sound of breaking came from the living room window, like a branch thrown by a storm, and then a second clatter. The world took a breath. I could tell from the location that glass had come down and someone had leaned into the empty frame and pressed weight onto the sill. Another weight hit the floor inside our house. I motioned with 2 fingers and we moved deeper into the basement toward the door at the far end that leads to the storm cellar. It is at ground level with steps that descend along one side in a tight turn. We had cleared it last spring and put a gasket on the door frame so it would seal against the wet. I opened it and felt the colder air of the cellar wash over my hands. We stepped inside and set the bar we had built to brace the inside of the doors that opened to the backyard. We had fashioned it from 2 lumber lengths, and a metal bracket bolted into the foundation blocks. It was not fancy, but it would stop a door pushed by a shoulder. I set the bar in place and dropped the latch. Footsteps moved above us now, the weight careful and slow, and then too fast as if coordination did not come easy. The sound of something kicking the metal leg of a table rang through the floor joists. I thought of the heavy cabinet in the living room where we store photo albums and books of lesson plans and a shoebox full of ticket stubs from movies and fairs. I imagined a hand dragging along its edge like a person feeling their way in a room with smoke. I did not let that picture settle. I kept to the list. The next item was to wait, to stay quiet, and to respond if needed with controlled force that made an opening to leave. It is strange to hear your mind use words like opening and controlled force when you are also counting breaths and making sure your wife's shoulder touches yours so you can both feel alive. The cellar smells like damp concrete and earth. There is the faint sweetness of old lumber and the metal tang of the tools I keep in a box, labelled by category to make bad days easier. I put the axe gently against the wall where it would not clatter if someone brushed it. Caleb sat on the bottom step, gripping his backpack straps, as if he needed his hands to be holding something. Lena leaned back against the cool wall and closed her eyes for 2 long seconds, then opened them and smiled at me in a way I have seen only a few times in our life together, the last when the doctor had said the word miscarriage quietly, and with the gentleness of someone who had had to say it too often. Her smile then had meant, "We are here," and it meant that now. The radio voice restarted and then changed. "Containment failed. Stay hidden. Do not respond to outside voices." It added the last sentence without any change in tone. as if it had always been part of the message and we had just missed it. The words landed like a hand on my shoulder. We froze. The house above us moved again, and then we heard it. A voice from our back porch calling, "Help!" It was Lena's voice. The first accounting of it in my mind was not recognition of the words, but recognition of her cadence. The way she says the H in help with a soft breath, because her grandmother spoke that way, and she picked it up unconsciously. I turned to her to say something, and she was beside me. The porch voice called again, "Help!" The single word bent in a way I had heard only when she had lost her voice to a cold. It called again and added, "Please." It sounded exactly like her and not like a recording or a trick. It took my mind a full 3 seconds to make the parts line up. It could not be her. She was here. Caleb's eyes flicked between the door and Lena. He mouthed the word mimic, as if the letters might break the spell if he said them out loud. The emergency voice repeated its addition, "Do not respond to outside voices." The thing on the porch said, "It's me." And then, as if it had been practicing in an empty room, it tried her laugh, and the sound scraped like a chair on cement. Null, who had shifted between a guard stance and an anxious lean, tucked herself partly behind Lena's leg and did not make a sound. After a time that could have been a minute or an hour, the footsteps above retreated, and our house quieted except for the wind and the faint drips where rain still fell from the eaves. Our breathing the only intentional sound. The night did not end. Dawn, which in every other night of my life came surely, felt like a rumour. I checked my watch again and saw the hands slide through 5:50 a.m. and then towards 6. A grey line gathered along the edge of the glass block window. Darkness thinned, but did not break. The choice we had talked around and not named presented itself the way the road presents itself at a washed-out bridge. We could stay in the cellar and hope the message to stay hidden would eventually be replaced by a clearer one, and that people on the other end of radios would regain control. We had water and food enough for days if we rationed. The house had been compromised, but the cellar had secure locks. We could use the basement bathroom if we were careful. The other choice was to move at first light, cut through our neighbour's backyard and the field behind the retired dentist's house, and make for the water tower on the ridge. The tower has a small service building with a flashing red beacon on top that blinks when power is off and the backup systems are engaged. When I had driven home, I'd seen a faint red blink against the fog in that direction. If the tower's systems were on, there might be other people there, or at least a vantage point to see the town and decide where a safe pocket might be. Moving would mean sound and risk. Staying would mean waiting and hoping the broadcast would turn into a plan. We watched the light grow from black to a grey that gave edges to the shovel handle and to the toolbox silhouettes. I told Lena the plan I had formed while we had counted breaths. We would wait until the grey was strong enough to distinguish a person from a post at 10 yards. We would move through the backyard to the storm cellar doors, open them gently and listen. If the yard was clear, we would cross to the neighbour's fence, lift the loose board where my friend Dan and I always exchanged tools, and pass through into his yard. From there, we would slip behind the hedges that line the alley and then cut across the old orchard property that has not seen fruit in 10 years. We would move slowly. We would not speak except for short words we agreed upon. We would not run unless we had to. If we saw someone who needed help and we could help them without exposing ourselves to serious risk, we would help. If we could not, I would make a mark in my mind of the location and we would plan a return if our situation allowed it. I checked the axe and the heavy flashlight, whose head is also a blunt tool. I checked the screwdriver set in my pocket, because opening backlot fences sometimes requires quiet work. I gave Caleb my work gloves because hands slip on wet wood. He argued for a second and then pulled them on. Lena took the radio and turned the volume to 1 notch above mute so we could catch any change. She had looped a scarf through Niall's collar, not to pull her, but to steady her if she tried to surge towards something. I lifted the bar on the cellar doors and pressed an ear against the seam. It felt like listening against a clamshell for the sea, wind, a faint drip, No feet. When I pushed the doors up, they resisted at first because the seal had done its job overnight. The wood creaked a syllable that sounded loud to me and probably to no one else. Grey air slipped down the stairs. The backyard lay under a thin veil of mist, the neighbour's maple dripping slowly into a puddle by the fence. The motion sensor light next door had reset and was dark. The hedges were shapes. The alley was a tunnel. The world had a patience that made me hate it. We stepped into the morning. The wet on the cellar doors made my fingers ache. Null moved with her head low, ears forward, breathing slow. We crossed the small yard we had mowed 1,000 times and never thought of as cover. The neighbour's board slid free of the nails with a soft rasp like pages turning. My shoulders found the exact place to pass between hedge and fence without brushing the leaves too hard. We moved along the alley with our feet placing on the balls first to keep from slapping water. At the corner where the alley meets the old orchard's fence, we stopped. I raised a hand. On the other side of the fence, in the wide empty lot, where the dentist once planted a dozen apples, 3 figures stood 10 yards apart. Their clothes were soaked and plastered to them. One swayed slightly with his head cocked. Another had a hand extended, as if he had forgotten what he wanted to pick up and was still searching the air for the object. The third had his face turned toward the sound of a generator that thumped softly in the distance. We crouched. The fence boards were spaced enough that we could see through, and the gaps made a frame for each figure's slow movements. We waited for the space between their patterns to open. People have rhythms even when they are not making choices. When the first turned away, and the second took a step that shifted him behind an elm's trunk, and the third tilted his chin toward the road, we slid along the fence to the corner, lifted the board below the old loose nail I had always meant to replace, and slid through into the grass. I cannot say that this is heroism. It is pattern recognition and practice under pressure. Heroism is a word you say after. We crossed the lot. The wet grass soaked our knees. The highway beyond the ridge made a low hiss. The town to our left had become a living map of small noises. In the house 2 down, a door hinge squealed and then stopped. Somewhere to the north, a car alarm chirped and gave up. The hospital's generator shifted load and hummed a different note. We heard voices, not all at once, but once each. Help! Please! And it is me. Delivered in tones that missed the human part by a degree that would have gone unnoticed in any other context, and that now cut me in a way I do not want to describe. We reached the narrow service road that climbs to the water tower and stopped at the bottom. The tower itself is a pale blue cylinder with a white stripe and the words Town of Millstone in letters that flake at the edges. The service building next to it is a squat concrete block with a steel door and a small light that blinks red when the alarm panel inside is in backup mode. The red light blinked faintly through the mist like a heartbeat. I had fixed the panel once after a raccoon found its way into the conduit and chewed something it should not have. The panel only beeps during the day. At night we set it to silent so it does not disturb the houses below. It was silent now. The tower's ladder is caged, but slick in wet weather. I did not want to climb it unless we needed the view. We crept up the service road. The gravel helped our footing and hurt our quiet. At the top, the world slid into view. The river valley with its broad water dull under cloud. The bridge with cars stopped at odd angles. The high school's parking lot, a pattern of headlights left on and then drained by the night. The hospital's windows warm and then snapping to dark and then warm again as the generator load shed and recovered. Smoke rose from 2 spots like threads. The red light on the tower kept its slow cycle. We crouched behind the service building wall and listened. It felt at first as if we had gotten away with something. The hilltop had space and air and a distance from the ground, where we had felt every footstep like a threat. Then the wind shifted. Sound carries differently on ridges. A breath and Nal's quiet huffing felt too loud. Down in the trees at the base of the hill, movement began that did not look like deer. You could see shapes detach from tree trunks where they had stood like shadows and then turn toward the red blink as if asked a question. We had made noise climbing. The red light had been blinking before we arrived, and still they had not gathered until a new sound joined it. I do not pretend at grand conclusions in moments like this. I note the fact that sound draws and that movement follows sound, and I adjust. We ducked into the lee of the service building and tried the steel door. It opened because the maintenance lock is one we use across all town sites, and because I am the one who oils it each fall. Inside, there is an alarm panel with a diagram of the tower's valves and the water level readout. The water was at 72%, which is good for a morning. The alarm light on the panel blinked and the display said power fail, running on backup. The backup battery said 70% as well. There was a small workbench with a first aid kit and a binder with procedures printed on cardstock. A corkboard held a diagram of the pressure zones with pencil notes from 3 years ago when we had to flush the system. The room smelled of paper, rubber gasket, and the faint damp that concrete always holds. We closed the door gently and did not latch it, a trick that lets you push out without any clack. We crouched in the corner where the concrete wall meets the cabinet. The shapes at the base of the hill moved with that uneven pattern that had become a language we were starting to read. They did not climb like a group. They drifted one by one and then turned when they did not hear anything else. It was the motion of people in a grocery store when the power goes out and everyone waits for the emergency lights to come on. It would have been ordinary if not for what we had heard by our door and the way voices had come from mouths with no one in them. In the close quiet, the radio changed again. I had kept the volume at a bare thread to catch changes without drawing anyone. Now the message clicked mid-sentence, hissed, and then a different voice spoke. Not the mechanical reader, but a human voice winded as if pushing each word out ahead of breath. It said, "If you can hear this, do not gather in large groups. Stay hidden. Do not respond to imitations. Do not use." It cut, and the mechanical voice resumed with the monotone list. Lena adjusted the tuning dial by a fraction and then shook her head. The voice did not return. If it had, I do not know if we would have believed it either. Trust was now something that needed context and history. We stayed until full morning slid onto the hill in a weak grey. The world felt slower, not because it was safe, but because the first frantic hours had passed, and because that is what bodies do to survive long things. They slow the clock so you can keep your place in the long line of minutes. I took the second to decide whether we would stay through the day or move to another spot. I decided that the hill was both a vantage and a trap. Sound here travelled too far. The building had one door. If we needed to leave, the only way was down where shapes gathered. Staying would be safer only if we had a reason to stay, like a radio contact that promised something concrete. We had none. "We could cut south along the ridge," I said. "There are hedgerows and deer paths. We can skirt the town and see if anyone has gathered at the firehouse or the community centre. If we find a house with people and a plan, we can join them. If not, we find a place to hold." Lena nodded. Caleb asked if we would go back to his house, his voice not a challenge, just a person asking the question that had been threading his thoughts since he knocked on our door. I did not hesitate. "We will," I said, "but not until we have a better path to get there. Right now, the alley and the street are not good. There is a way through the old quarry service road that runs behind your place. We use that." He nodded and looked at the ground for a moment. "Thank you," he said, and I realized he had been bracing for another answer and had prepared himself to accept it, and my heart had to sit down and breathe for a second. We checked the door. The hill base was quiet again except for wind sliding through the scrub pines. We stepped into a world that had decided to keep being a world, which is both unkind and the only way any day happens after a bad one. We moved along the ridge, keeping to the side where the slope breaks toward the river. We passed a picnic table wet with mist and a historical marker about the town's founding that I had never read and did not read now. We saw a fox ghost through saplings like smoke and disappear into a tangle of multiflora rows. We heard, once, a human voice singing a lullaby with the wrong notes and wrong pauses, then stop. By late morning, a diluted daylight had washed the valley so that colours returned. The diner's striped awning looked like something from a past life. The car dealership lot shone with beads of water on hoods. The billboard on Route 9 peddled a contractor's number and a promise of no-interest financing, as if someone still needed a deck replaced. We cut behind the community centre and saw its doors propped open with a chair and a paper taped to the glass. From too far to read, it could have been a list or a map. We had to decide whether to go down and check or continue along the ridge to the quarry road. It is not dramatic to say that decisions like this were now how lives divided, but that is what they were. We made for the community centre because there is a difference between avoiding risk and avoiding everything. As we neared, the parking lot revealed 3 cars and a truck. Drivers' doors left open, no people. The building's interior was dark except for a skylight over the lobby. The paper on the door said in marker, "Closed, shelter at school gym." The handwriting wobbled the way people's do when they write fast with a marker on glass. Below it, someone else had added, "Hospital is full, avoid main." Another line, different handwriting, cramped and careful, added, "They copy voices." Then a final line said, "If you hear one that sounds like someone you love, do not answer. Wait. Think." The marker had smudged slightly where mist had drifted under the awning. We stood under the awning and looked at the words without speaking. Right then, I believed 3 things. First, that we were not alone in making sense of what we had seen. Others had seen it and written it down in case we missed it. Second, that even small notes like this could help a person in a moment when their heart pulled them toward a door because a wish had been spoken in the right voice. Third, that staying hidden could keep you alive, but waiting for someone else to decide your fate would not. We moved on. The quarry service road begins behind the centre and snakes along the back lots of the older part of town. It crosses a small culvert that had washed out 2 summers ago, and that the town had never fully repaired, forcing a careful step. It ends near the fence behind Caleb's house. We crouched in scrub and watched his backyard for 10 minutes. No movement, no sound. The curtains in the kitchen hung open 2 inches. Do you move then? Do you wait? We move, I said, and we did, along the fence line to the gate that sticks and then through into gravel behind his garage. Inside his kitchen, the window over the sink had been left open an inch, which was the way his mother always kept it to let the house breathe. The back door was locked. I used the screwdriver to shift the interior latch, a trick I learned doing our own locks. The door opened quietly. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee someone had poured and not drunk. 2 mugs were on the counter and a third in the sink. A tote with batteries and a flashlight sat on a chair. A note on the fridge in block letters said, "To Aunt Lena, back soon." I did not know if it had been for him or for the aunt. He swallowed hard and took the note down and folded it with more care than any paper that Short had ever seen. We checked the rooms. No one. We gathered some things Caleb knew his parents would want him to take if he had to. He looked at the pictures on his living room shelf and took one that had all 3 of them in a park in winter. He slid it into his backpack between a sweater and a bag of rice. We wrote a note. "We came through at 10:15 a.m. We are okay. We will try the school gym next. Love, C." We set it on the kitchen table under the salt shaker so wind would not take it. When we closed the door and stepped back into the yard, I felt the lightness of doing a hard thing and the weight of the story we did not know the end of. From there, the path to the school gym would cross Main, where the storefronts and small apartments stack close and echo any sound you make. We could avoid it by taking the Riverwalk path, which is lower but lined by chain link that can make you slow. We chose the Riverwalk. It kept us away from the hill where a group of shapes had begun to collect near the hardware store, drawn by a noise we could not hear but could imagine. A car alarm that a gust had nudged, or a store alarm that had lost power and then found it and did not know its status anymore. We moved in single file with Nala in the lead and Lena in the rear to watch our backs. We paused under the bridge. where water dripped in a single steady place from a seam in the concrete. The school stands 2 blocks inland, a flat roof and long windows, doors at the back that open onto a loading zone where the cafeteria trucks pull on weekday mornings. Today, the loading zone held 3 cars, parked skewed as if the drivers had pulled in quickly. One still had a blinking turn signal even without power, because turn signals blink by a thermal strip that warms and cools, and does not need a full grid to do its job. That small, steady blink made tears start in my eyes the way completely ordinary things can be the hardest to stand. We listened at the gym's side door. No sound. We tried the knob. It was unlocked. Inside, the gym had the echo of a huge empty room. The bright banners that celebrated district championships for teams no one outside town had heard of hung still. A table near the door had a stack of forms, pens, and a jug of water. A handwritten list on a legal pad said check in, and below it, 6 names with times beside them in proper 12-hour format. Then a line with no name. Then a blank page like someone had been interrupted. On the far side, near the stage, someone had set up cots in neat rows. Some were mussed, some had blankets folded at the corners. There was a smell of coffee and of a gym cleaned a day ago and not yet used. We followed the layout rules for shelters as if the staff were watching. We called softly. Hello? We used names from the list. Janet? Officer Alvarez? No answer. We stayed aware of doors. We took what we needed. A phone charger, some gauze, a roll of athletic tape that could be used to secure a bandage or to seal a draft on a door, a marker to write notes more clearly than with a pencil. We left an entry on the pad. Hartley, L. Hartley, Caleb M. Passed through 11 a.m., headed south, dog. We paused before adding dog, and then did. It could matter. At the far end of the gym, by the stage curtain, an emergency radio sat on a chair and repeated the same message we had heard all night. Do not go outside, lock all doors, stay hidden. A custodian's cart sat nearby with a keyring hanging from it that weighed £1 and included keys to nearly every door in the building and half the town, because that is how towns work. I took it, not as theft, but as continuity. If I found a door I could lock behind us, I would. Outside, the day had become an overcast afternoon that painted everything with a flat wash. We decided to shelter in the small classroom at the gym's side because it had only one high window and a door that could be barred with a cart. We set a watch with one of us half dozing and the other listening. We ate in silence and tried to keep the noise of rappers to a minimum. The radio, even at low volume, filled the room with stress. We turned it off and turned it on every 15 minutes to check for changes. After one of those checks, the voice said something new, just once. If you are in Millstone, do not approach the hospital. Repeat, do not. And then the loop resumed. We accepted that we would not know why until later. We fell into a pattern. Afternoons slid toward evening, without the kind of sunset you can point to. Somewhere in the middle of our wait, footsteps came to the hallway outside and then stopped. We froze. A voice said, hello, in the tone of a person at a door holding a package. It sounded exactly like our mail carrier, a man named Jeff whose lines for conversation always included the weather and something positive about dogs. The voice said, Nala, in his way, where he drew the A so it sounded like a song. Nala's ears shot forward, and she whined once in a confused way, then put her head down on her paws in a posture that asked me to fix a world I could not. We did not answer. The voice stood outside a long time and then said, it's me, in a way that almost found the right music, and then did not. By night we knew we would not sleep properly. The emergency message did not change. The town continued to express itself in taps and thumps and voices that missed human by a fraction. We had flashes of normal. Lena telling a story about a student who used to label every crayon in the box with the day of the week it was allowed to be used on. Caleb describing how his father insists the proper way to season a cast iron skillet is, with light coats and patience. Me explaining the way a recloser measures current and then decides whether to try closing again. We spoke to fill space and to remember how people speak. When the first edge of dawn finally pushed a paler grey into the window, all of us were already awake. I cannot say what we had decided until that moment, because we were deciding all night without deciding. Then I stood, and the movement carried the conclusion with it. I said we would move at first light toward the South Ridge, away from the hospital and away from Maine. We would keep close to cover, and we would follow the sound of the river to where houses thin and farms begin. We would look for smoke that means cooking, not burning. We would remain hidden if we could, and ready to act if we had to. We tightened our packs and checked our dog's collar and wrote one more note on the pad, leaving at first light. If you come after us, move quietly and do not answer any voice unless you can see the person and know them. We wrote it in block letters to make it simple, even if a person had shaking hands. We stood at the door and listened. The building kept the night's heat for us a few minutes more. Outside, the morning was colder and cleaner. The town had not fixed itself while we waited. The emergency message had not become specific. The people we cared about were either moving or waiting or gone, and we did not know which. We stepped out into the dim morning. The red blinking light on the water tower still pulsed through the mist like a metronome. Somewhere out there, other people had made other choices and were walking towards something. The broadcast had said to stay hidden. It had said it so many times that the words had lost their edges. We had obeyed as far as it made us safer and kept us from mistakes. Now it only kept us from movement. I looked at our street and the water on the asphalt and the hill where our house stood and the school and the hospital and the town without a voice that was its own. I said to Lena and to Caleb, more to make it real in the air than for any other reason, we move at first light. We did. Before we left the edge of the gym lot, I looked back once and saw in the grey of the morning the shape of the world I had known and the outline of one I did not. I heard the emergency message begin another loop and felt a small, stubborn flame of anger that it had not changed into something more useful. I let it go because anger is a bad compass. We cut between the hedges and stepped into the damp of the grass along the South Ridge. The world received our footsteps and gave nothing back except space. I do not know where the story ends. I know the line we crossed was necessary. The broadcast said to stay hidden, but if no one comes, hiding will just mean dying slow. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.